Platform diagram, really straightforward. Two key components in the middle. So first one being userver, and this is a specific here on network device. So it can be physically on-premise or it can be virtualized or in the cloud, but the key thing is we have an on-network component, and that's essentially our data collector, and it's collecting data from the devices. So the hardware, software, AV and UC devices and all the spaces, essentially going off, integrating it with them through a piece we call a driver. So essentially how we communicate between the land of Utelogy and the APIs that those hardware and software manufacturers release. Essentially go off, gather data, pull it back to userver, send it up a single secure pipe to umanage. Userver, you'll notice, is also where we do the configuration. So it's also where we configure the system, and we'll do a quick run through of that, just literally to show you how quick and easy it is to onboard devices to a userver. I think that's important, so you know there's not a lot of pain to actually get this up and running. Key thing being that's literally all we do on userver. So we set it up, configure the devices, and everything else is done from other parts of the platform. So other things on screen here, the other key element I spoke about is umanage. I refer to this as our pretty front end. It's essentially where we can get all of our dashboards, we can get our reports, where we can see all of the information that we're gathering from all of those assets, so those devices, in a singular pane of glass, essentially. It's also where we get the data out of the system. So it's also where we have our ServiceNow integration. We can do email alerts. We do have a REST API, so you can integrate to any other ITSM platform. And then we also have data connectors, so you can take a full database dump to your BI platform of choice, typically Power BI or Tableau. The other key elements you see on screen here, uControl. We actually started life as a uControl, as an in-room control manufacturer. So think of the likes of Crestron, AMX, Extron, etc. Except the key differentiator with ours was it was centralized. So it was all hosted on a singular userver for that entire site, not a processor per room, which then the uControl runs on a HTML interface. So anything that has a modern browser can open it. However, typically now it's not our key focus. We actually use that for technicians panels. So we can actually deploy a control interface a technician can have on a tablet, have access to every single room and have all of the controls he needs right there in one single place while he's walking around and mobile. The final piece on screen, and kind of our silver bullet, if you will, is our UAutomate piece. And I see this used in two ways. So firstly, power saving. We have the ability to schedule power saving scenarios. So for example, we can turn devices on at night, on in the morning, off at night, but be a bit smarter than maybe the typical power saving that's been done in the past. And the way we would do that is we would turn the device on or off and then actually ask it, we'll wait 30 seconds because we've got that constant communication to it and say, did you turn on or off? And essentially, if it didn't, the actual goal of our test wasn't to send the power on command, it was for the device to be powered on. So we've actually got the ability to check that after we've sent, the power on or power off. The second way I see that used is the active room test. So actually, in the middle of the night, we'll turn that system on and actually perform some checks to make sure it's ready for use that day. So doing things like we can play sound from the speakers and listen on the microphones to check that the whole audio system in that room is working. We can do things like make test calls depending on the codec. And then we can even, obviously we'll check the system to make sure it's on and change between sources if required, depending on how we're going to check that space. Okay, and as I mentioned, the first thing we're going to do is go and look at our userver, so actually where we can configure the devices. So first thing we do, we actually, before we even get to devices or rooms, we set up a location tree. So we can actually base rooms all over the world and actually geolocate them in a tree structure. So essentially this can match any of your existing systems, but actually so you can easily find where that room is and be able to know where that is instantly. And then we onboard a room. So for example, here I've got my boardroom, and this is actually going to be the room that we'll be using throughout the entire demo. So you'll see a common theme here in terms of devices and the elements that we're going to be looking at and controlling. But obviously the first thing we need to do is onboard devices into the system. So this room, as you can see, is already pre-set up. But if I wanted to onboard a device, I would simply go to add a device. I can go to our driver library and essentially I can search to see all of the devices that we currently have support for. So you'll see currently there are 1,219 drivers available. And as mentioned, a driver is a unique integration to an API. So you'll see some of these have multiple model numbers listed. And especially if we look at one of the display manufacturers, lots of models listed here because each one of those sizes will use the same API. So that 1,200-ish drivers will use somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 5,000 different unique models of support. What we do, we would simply download the driver for the device that we want to onboard. So again, we've got some pre-prepared here. And essentially to configure that device, I can show you one I've done earlier. We'd give it a friendly name. So for example, Gouda PDU. We choose a model from the drop-down list. And again, this one, they're very similar models, but if I had something like a display, you can see again, we get all the size of the display that is supported by that particular driver. And then we tell the system how we're going to communicate with it. So we can do things like onboard a host name or IP address. And then for some devices, they're also going to require a username and password to be able to onboard that. Once we've done that, we click File Save, and that device is being monitored. Essentially, all of the brains have been built into the back end of the driver. So essentially, we have the ability to poll that device on an interval for all of the information it has to offer. And instantly you've got access to all of the commands available, so you can actually control that device from the system. Okay. The only other thing really that we're going to set up here as part of the demo is going to be some of our what we would term as self-healing scenario. So a really important thing that we actually implement is when we build out these systems, but to actually determine the use cases for when a self-healing scenario takes place. So essentially where we've got something that's determined that's an issue in a space, or something's not in optimal, it's not in a compliant state, so it's not working the way it should be. But we can actually detect that and put that right without having to have a user step in or a technician step in and actually make that change. So a good example of that, you can see here, I've got my self-titled display source self-healing. So if we detect that a display is currently powered on and it's not on HDMI source, essentially that's not in a compliant state for us because it should always be HDMI in this environment. So therefore we will actually come in and when we actually control this, you can see that we've actually got this set up. So if it's not on HDMI, we instantly set it back after 5 seconds. And then we actually do some logging, so we can actually come through and see how many times that's happened. So we can still, as a support desk, make note of any of the self-healing scenarios that have taken place and actually report that back to the business as, we've not only fixed maybe 15 issues a month through user intervention, but we've also fixed this other 30 or however many issues through self-healing, and they were fixed within 5 seconds of the fault being detected. Essentially, as I mentioned, the only thing we do there is configuration of the space, and we do have quicker ways of deploying this. You don't have to do this manually every time. For example, we can do things like clone spaces. So essentially, you can keep all of those settings in there and just update IP addresses. Or we can do what we would term mass deployment, where essentially you feed us a template like this, so a room configured for each one of your room types, and then essentially an Excel sheet with all the information that changes per room. So typically IP address and maybe screen size, and we can mass deploy as many rooms as you have instantly. So as I said, that's everything for you server. So what I'll do is I'll head up to uManage now, and essentially I'll take you to our office account. So this is actually looking at that same system that we've just been configuring essentially in the back end. Also, a thing of note before we jump too far into this, we do actually have a live camera feed of that office. So you can actually see that the time actually matches where I am. So it is live. So as we make changes to this throughout the demo, we can actually look and see what happens in that space to actually, if we turn something on, turn it off, we can actually monitor that as well as our sort of automate scripts and things like that. Okay. So this is uManage. Is accessed through multi-factor authentication by default. However, we do support single sign-on should you want to use that via either Azure AD or Okta. And essentially, the first page that we come to is going to be our dashboards. So within dashboards, we never start you off with a blank piece of paper. We do now have we have a standard dashboard pack essentially that comes with every UManage account. However, these dashboards are fully configurable, so you can start from scratch, or you can take a copy of one of those standard pack and make the changes that you need to make that suit your business needs. So as a quick overview, we have 7 standard dashboards. The first one we come to is going to be our general dashboard. And essentially this covers all aspects of the system, but in not great detail. So you can kind of just get an overview of what the kind of information we can gather. So for example, you can see where that room is in the world, and you can see how many, currently we're looking at rooms with alerts, and you can see where those rooms are geolocated on a map. We can also see system summary. So for example, total number of rooms and how many rooms currently have alerts, how many are in use or in a call. We can see all of those, those stats at a glance. And then we can also start to look at some asset information. So for example, this is just a quick breakdown of all of the manufacturers that we have on site. So things like, you can see we've got 1 Cisco and 2 Gouda and 1 Lightware in our demo environment. However, on a typical customer estate, obviously there'll be a majority, to a few manufacturers. Coming a bit further down, one of the few things we can see is going to be our active alert. So essentially this is the flashing red light. Something's gone wrong on this estate, and we actually need someone to come in and have a look at it to see if they can resolve whatever issue that is. So right now you can see in our boardroom, we currently have 2 alerts, both related to poly touch panels being disconnected. So essentially we're missing the touch panel from our demo environment. And then you can also see we've got our demo area. We're missing our Tascam recorder at the moment. The final piece on this dashboard is going to be our historical alerting. So actually looking at what has gone wrong, not necessarily what's wrong right now, but actually a look back to see what we've done well or what's been causing us the most pain over the last period. So you can actually see here that when we've just moved office, we actually had 79% of our alerts caused by a singular Sony device, and again 96% of our alerts are connection based. However, if we know what that issue is and it's now being resolved, we can filter that out of our dashboards, and we can actually get a better breakdown of what are our biggest causes of pain on the system. So for example, you can see that currently Utelogy, again, that's going to be things like our Windows MTRs and other elements like that, or even just our our self-healing scenarios and those kind of elements. They're going to be the ones that are causing us the most alerts. But manufacturer-wise, it's going to be neat, and again, purely because that's in our demo, so we're going to be turning that on and off as we go through. Other alerts you can see here, they're not just all connection-based. So actually for the subject of the alert, we can see things like, again, self-healing, so how many times the system has self-recovered itself without human intervention. We can also see things like, overnight active room checks, where we can actually see that the test has failed because that system, didn't, something was not right in that space when we did that active room check. So essentially we failed to check for a technician to go and look at. And then the same thing, we've got our evening power ons, morning power offs, and then actually just an alert that tells us when a display's been switched off as part of the demo. To quickly skim through some of these, active alert dashboard. If I was a technician and actually going to be using this is the kind of dashboard I'd want to look at. It's just a very clean dashboard, but shows me the flashing red lights that I need to go and show some attention to straight away. We've also got, again, a bit more of an in-depth breakdown of the alerts that we've had in the system. So again, the historical view as to what's gone wrong on our site. So again, we're going to look at that summary over a year, over a month, over a week. So we can actually start to break down and see what we can do to reduce our alerts moving forward. And then also things by, breakdown by asset. So we can see, what models we've got and what locations, a bit of a breakdown that way, as well as things like what rooms we've got. And then finally, we come to sort of our usage graph. So actually, we can start to see how our systems are being used, not necessarily just, are they on, off, or are they working, or are they, are they dead? So that's some of the information that we can put in. The final dashboard we've got is going to be our power dashboard. And essentially, that is our, it's an estimate to actually how much power we've used on that site, or how much power we saved through maybe you automate power saving, things like that. So the way we work this out, just to sort of cover that in some detail, we we are constantly talking to those AV devices, so we know when they're powered on and we know when they're powered off. And essentially, from that, we know from the manufacturers how much power they use out the box. We can get a rough calculation as to how much power they use when they're in on mode, or how many hours they've been in on mode and how much power that totals. And then when they're in standby mode, they still use some power, although generally significantly less. And we can actually work out, if I look at the displays last week, we can see that potential energy used was going to be 13.4 kilowatts. Actual is going to be 6.4, so that's a 7 saving, working out somewhere around 52% saving. So next tab over is reports. Essentially, at the end of the day, Utelogy is a big database, is sort of how I preface this. There is, we capture a lot of data about a lot of things. So reports is your opportunity to pull that system out and create your own data tables with the information you want to see. There are 3 cardinal types of reports: alert, asset, and room, and they kind of do what they say on the tin. So alerts looking at all of the alerts that we've ever had in the system and actually breaking that down. We can also see assets, so we can pull asset information as well as any of the data that we capture we can pull into a report, and I've got an example I can show you of that. And then we've also got room data, so if you want to capture things like room usage, things like that, current status, we can show that information on a room report. So the one we're looking at here is alerts, and you can see currently I've got this filtered by warning. So again, we can actually see things like when our displays have been switched off, because that's been a warning we've had. We've also got other alerts down here. So for example, our self-healing alerts, when things have actually been resolved through those self-healing scenarios, we can see the log of when that's happened. And again, you can see that lots happened on Friday. Asset, I mentioned we can sort of pull any metric. So here's an example I was using earlier to help a customer. We were talking about standards of rooms, and they told me that every single one of their devices was connected to HDMI port 1 on the display. We went through and pulled a report and showed them that around 50% of them weren't. So what they thought was a standard turned out not to be. So that's the kind of information we can capture in an asset report, as well as more specific things, for example, like firmware version, serial number that we get of devices. So we can actually pull information, and this information is automatically populated from those device APIs. So as soon as we do that configuration I showed you earlier by filling in an IP, username and password, it gathers all of this information automatically. Okay. The next tab over is going to be rooms. And this is actually where we can start to dive into a specific room and actually even get all the way down to controlling the devices in that space as a technician. So firstly, when we come to this screen, we can still break this down by our location tree. So I could just look at the rooms that are in my particular office that I'm looking at or supporting today. And again, I'm going to come in and we're actually going to look at the boardroom that we've got in here. So first coming into this, the first thing that I see when I come into this is the status overview of all of the assets in that space. So you can see currently I've got, I don't know how many devices this is, 10 devices in this space. I can see they're all connected. I can see they're all powered on. I can see all but one have alerts. And again, that's that alert we looked at earlier with that Poly X30 touch panel not being connected. So again, we can see exactly where that alert is coming from in the system. We can also change this view depending on what we're looking to do. So for example, we can pull up asset view where we can see straight away an overview of the serial numbers. And if we wanted to, and again, an action for me is I need to go through and fill these in, where we can actually have asset tracking numbers that relate to, the stickers that are on the back of the devices. So we can actually log that in this system. Configuration more relates to maybe a support, what the configuration is of that system, including versions that you're using of Utelogy. And then network, this is a really useful tool when you're actually onboarding a new client. We can actually show them exactly how we're going to communicate with all of those devices, what IP addresses we're going to use, what protocols and ports. So we can send this straight off to your network team, and straight away they can open up the requirements to actually make this function, because it's all captured in our system. Okay. Coming a bit further down, we can see the alerts in the system. So again, just if we had more alerts on this tenant, we would see just the alerts that relate to this particular room. And then we can also see room level metrics as the next tab down. So for example, this is information that we capture about that room. So for example, how many capacity the seats have. We can see, does it have audio teleconference functionality or video teleconference? Is it currently in a call or is it occupied? And even things like we can fill in what type of room kind it is, because that enables us to do things like say which room kind actually causes us the most pain, not necessarily the individual manufacturers. Is it the huddle spaces where people go in and move things around because they don't touch things in the formal boardrooms? That's the kind of information we can capture and report on as well. Other things we can see, we actually have a document section associated with each room. So we can actually upload documentation that's going to assist our technicians in resolving the space, even if they haven't necessarily been to that space before. So this is something we can do. So typically we'd upload things like images of the room, line diagrams, elements like that to that space, essentially. So a technician can come in and understand how that room's laid out, where the hardware is physically located in the space if he needs to talk someone through something. But again, just so he's got an overview and all stored in that single pane of glass. Okay. So if we jump back into assets, we can actually go through and start looking at these devices and actually controlling them at this point. So from this page, we can select on any one of these and we'll choose the display because it's nice and big and obvious and bright in our camera feed. But essentially, the first page we come to is going to be our latest release, which is Tech Tool, and we call this Tech Tool in the cloud. And essentially, it gives us, firstly, the live overview of this device, where we can see live communications back and forth, as well as control and all the information we're gathering. And then, as I mentioned, give that user the ability to control that device. So just working our way down the page here, obviously we can see if there's any alerts associated with this device that have been generated. So things like we can't talk to it, there's a network issue, elements like that. We then see things like all of the live state pins, so all of the information that we're gathering from that device. So this is all the information that updates frequently that we're showing on screen here. And then coming a bit further down, we can see the commands that are available. And in the top right, you'll notice I have a toggle switch that's giving me the ability to put this device into edit mode. So if I do that, we can effectively control this device straight away. So if I scroll down a little bit, you can see currently the technician will be able to see that currently video mute is off. Let's turn video mute on. I get a confirmation message, and I can actually see that pin is updated. And actually now, if I switch back to my live setup, you can actually see that I'm controlling that device and doing whatever I need to do to resolve that ticket. And again, if I turn video mute off, once again, we see that message has gone through. We'll see that's responded in the state pin. And then we'll see that the system is now working again as it should be. So whatever that technician needs to do to resolve that space, he can do that from here. Okay. Coming to the bottom of the screen, the final element on this Tech Tool page is going to be our monitor window. And essentially, this is where we can see the live communication going backwards and forwards to this device. So typically, this doesn't mean a lot to most people because it's in hex, but you can actually see how often we're polling those messages. And just to talk you through a little bit what we're seeing here, here is our question that we're asking the display. So for example, in this case, we're asking it what aspect ratio it's set to. And here's the response back noted by a greater than symbol at the front. So that tells us it's a response back from that display, actually telling us that it's responding to the message we're asking. So other things on the screen that we're going to be looking at, again, we can see all the metrics of this device, and here we can actually see when they last changed. So for example, we can see that this display has been powered on for 3 hours. It's been online for 4. And again, all of this information coming all the way down, we can see that the serial number and MAC address has been the same since we configured this device 36 days ago. So again, typical of a system, the serial number and MAC don't typically change, but if an example, if you had to replace this display with a new one, so say this one went faulty or was broken, if it uses the same IP address or host name, we can actually replace this device and it will automatically update those entries because essentially we're talking to it in the same way. It will just update the information that we've got. We're going to switch over to Uautomate now, and essentially this is where we can run our automated scripts and schedules. So we've got 3 configured, and they're actually related to the two ways that we use Uautomate typically. So you can see we've got power saving, so morning power on, evening power off. And then we have that second way, which is that overnight active room check, which obviously you can see straight away as a much longer check. But again, it performs 16 different elements every single day. So if we look at one of these, we're going to take the morning power on as an example. So here we're turning the system on. We're going to wait a period and then actually check that the system is operating the way that it should be, based on that power script. So the first thing we do is the device health check block. Essentially, this checks that all devices were connected to Utelogy at the time of the test running, because something may have gone off overnight and come back on when we've come back to work the next day. But essentially, we need to make sure that if we're sending the power on command to that display, that both the display and everything else in the room were on the network at the time we wanted to do that. And essentially, if they're not, we almost want to fail that check before we even begin, because we know at that point it's not going to receive its power on command. So other things we've got, system macro power on. So we've actually got the ability to power on that system. So you can see here, we're just recalling the macro to do so. We've then got the delay built in, as I mentioned. So we're going to give that screen 60 seconds to actually switch on. And then we're actually going to build the state checks. So this is the important bit. We're now actually checking that the goal of the test has been met, or the script. So we're going to say, does the display power equal to on, essentially? And if that condition is not met, we're actually going to throw an error and give a message to that technician to say, display did not switch on. So when he comes in first thing in the morning, he'll go to this test log in the section, which we'll get to in just a short while, and he'll actually get a report and he'll tell him exactly what's gone wrong in that space and actually what he needs to do to resolve those issues. The final check in here is actually that we want to make sure that that display source is equal to HDMI at the same time, because obviously turning it on is one thing, but making sure it's showing content is another. So we want to make sure that we're actually receiving, we're on the right input, ready to receive content. The power off is much the same schedule, and then we've actually got our active overnight room check, where we're actually, as I mentioned, we're doing a lot more. So start's very similar. So we're going to have a device health check everything's online. We're then going to run a system macro again to turn the display on. And then this is the new section where we're actually going to start performing an audio check. So we break that into a section called audio check. We then effectively start the test tone. So that's actually using one of the devices in the room to generate an audio test tone in the space. So it will be making noise. So again, typically this is something that we run overnight when no one's going to be using those spaces. We then added the delay in to allow that noise to play from the speaker and actually to propagate around the room. And then we do a check audio level. So actually we ask the system to check the audio level. It does do it on an interval, but it doesn't do it very frequently, because typically we don't need that. But obviously during an active check, we need to poll that during the check. So it's quite important that we send that command. And then the important thing here, we're actually saying that we want to make sure our ceiling mic audio meter decibel level is greater than or equal to currently 15 decibels. However, we might want to increase that depending on the threshold or the requirements of that space. So we want to make sure we get that. If we don't receive 15 decibels, we're actually going to throw an error and say the audio level not met required threshold, prompting a technician to go to that space and actually check the audio system to make sure it's working the way that it should be. We then simply state check the display, and then essentially we do a system power off, so shut the system back down, and then the final thing that we do is actually make sure that that system is switched off, because obviously what we don't want to do is ruin our sort of power saving and what we're trying to achieve by leaving the system on off through our scheduled script. So with those scripts that we've built, we essentially need to schedule them. So you can see here I've got those 3 scheduled at different times. So we turn our system on first at 6 a.m. in the morning. We then turn it back off again at 10 p.m. And actually our active overnight room check is at 4 a.m. essentially. So we're actually running that 5 days a week to actually catch those systems. catch those errors. And what you may have noticed is that our evening power off is actually 7 days. And the reason we do that is if someone has happened to go into that space on a weekend, they do have it available for use. However, we're not going to run that display all day every weekend. But essentially what we'll do is if they do turn it on and they do happen to forget to turn it off, we'll still catch that and actually turn that back off for our power saving. Final thing, and again, the actual way that we're going to be using this moving forward is actually through our test logs. We can actually see what's happened. So here we can see a list of all of the actions that have happened in the previous days. So we can actually see that, if I look at today, we actually did an overnight active room check at 4 a.m. We did a morning power on again at 6 a.m. So actually turn the system on, and we can click on any one of these and see the report that we get from that system. And again, if I was a technician, I would actually be checking this with my morning cup of coffee to actually see where I need to go first thing in the morning to resolve any issues so that users can use those spaces ready. What we can see here, we've got things like I can see the run date, so I can see the test start time, so actually what time this was run at, and actually how long it took to complete. So we actually took 2 minutes and 58 seconds to check this space. And we have the ability to run up to 50 rooms at the same time. So we could actually run 50 rooms in 2 minutes. And then it's just, every 50 rooms would take another 2 minutes and 58 seconds to complete. Coming down, we get the nice report. So we can see things like the list of the device health check. So was everything online and communicating with Utelogy at the time of the test? We can see we sent the power on and waited 10 seconds and that all happened successfully. We did our audio check. So we started the test tone, waited the 15 seconds. As I mentioned, we poll that, check that audio level in the space. And then essentially we were looking for a value of greater than or equal to 15 decibels. We actually got 54. So we more than met threshold on that one. So we can actually see that system is working the way it should be. And then coming a bit further down, we want to make sure that the screen did switch on from our earlier power on system. And essentially we've got the power off and the 30-second delay before we actually turn that system, check that that system has switched off. Again, ready for the morning power on at 6 a.m. Okay. Any questions on use serve?